It's the tail. It's a horse tail. It's a horsehair brush. It's a brushy tail. It's a horsehair tail. It's a long woolly tail. It's a horse brush. It's Mr. Colostomy's horse tail. It's a long, shaggy dog tail. It's also a mouse tail. It's a horse tail. It's a horsehair brush. It's a mouse tail. I don't know where it's going. I don't know if it has an end. It has a very abrupt end. It doesn't have a middle. It doesn't have ascending action, and it doesn't have descending action, but it does have conflict. Yes, it has conflicts of all kinds. So does it have a hero's journey? Circular narrative? No! It is serial literature. It doesn't have beginning or an end. Mr. Colostomy goes on forever. It doesn't have beginning or an end. It's Mr. Colostomy forever. It doesn't have beginnings or ends. It's Mr. Colostomy forever. It doesn't believe in beginnings or ends. Now Mr. Colostomy will take a solo. It doesn't have a beginning or an end. It's a weird book. Okay, hi guys. How is everybody? Welcome to the book launch of Mr. Colostomy. Thank you for tuning in. Here's the book. It comes out today. It's being born today. And let me see, what can I say about this book? So it's a serialized form of literature. So I was thinking about what this book is and its justification or its reason to exist, and why it might be interesting. And I thought about this one page where Mr. Colostomy, who's this horse character, gets pulled over by a cop in his car, and he says, he's asking him about his who he is, whether he's a racehorse or not. He says, goodness, no, I'm not a racehorse. I haven't the discipline. I was a disappointment to my bloodline. The cop says, tell me more. And he says, I was sired by mystery out of philosophy. And I think that is kind of the key to this book. That's probably the best line in this book. Because, yeah, Mr. Colostomy is mystery and philosophy. And basically the form, I think, is very important for this book. The idea that it's a daily strip, a daily comic, for a number of reasons, and it's dedicated to Scheherazade, the first cartoonist. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the serialization and what the form means in terms of it being like a sort of philosophical work. So I found this copy of the Arabian Nights at one point when I was I had started the comic strip already. I wanted to post something to Instagram, as people were starting to do, as Instagram kind of became a replacement or surrogate newspaper forum for people to post serialized stories. And I've always loved serialization, starting with zines that I was doing. Even in high school, I was doing a zine, trying to put out something regularly into the world. But yeah, but then I saw this Arabian Nights and I was like, well, Scheherazade, the 101 Nights, just kept adding to this story. And it has no real structure. I would say it has kind of like digressions and stories within stories and sort of boxes, little packages with infinite stories within them, and digressions and kind of shaggy dog meanderings. And I was thinking a lot about the meander of the story and the wandering of the story, and how that formally is possibly very philosophically important, to not have structure, to actually like go against the concept of a normal structure. Because I think there's a weird like piece of dust on me. I'm going to remove. This is. Oh my God, it's a worm. No, it's not a worm. I was thinking a lot about structureless things that, you could say, oh, this doesn't have any form to it, or doesn't have any structure, but actually there is a structure even in dreams or dream logic. The so-called unconscious has its own structure that's trying to say things to you. So I wanted to do this daily strip, and I just started. I think that it has some rules to it, some kind of game rules, which are useful if you're trying to do something that's sort of an experiment. And I would say this is very much in the tradition of, experimental novels or something like that, rather than even comics. This isn't really a comic. This is an experiment, experimental artwork, I guess. But it is a comic. Okay, so my rules were that I had to sit down, I had to draw this in public. I couldn't leave the space I was drawing it in until the page was finished. And so I would sit down, and I can show you the originals. They're not too interesting because they look exactly like the printed thing. But where normally I would like type a story and then kind of adapt it. Here, I'll try to find the first Colostomy strip. I think I drew it in this sketchbook. Yeah. Well, I don't know where the first one went, but this is the second one. So I would just sit down and rule out first one panel, and then I would fill that, and then I would move on to the second panel, and third and the fourth. But they all have this kind of pattern, the same square 4-panel grid. And I couldn't do more than one in a day. It had to be one per day. And I don't know, there's a certain feeling of like clocking into the job that I had to accomplish. And I became so obsessed with like doing this every day that nothing else mattered. I would like leave, not go to an event or a party unless my strip was done. I had to get this done. It became very psychologically important to finish these strips. So they were just sketchbook. They were all drawn in sketchbooks. And the grid pattern, maybe more on that in a second. Okay, so there's something about this window, this 4-panel window pattern, like a cross, square, that for some reason was very soothing to a soothing form or formula to have for the comics. And I was thinking a lot about patterns and optics in this book. So the grid, the division of the grid started to become very interesting to me. And I was looking at things like this. Now, this is a book called The Clans and Tartans of Scotland. And it's just like a collection of different grid patterns. So that actually made its way into the comic you'll see here, with this kind of optical eyeballs staring out of it. And then, okay, so I was thinking a lot about patterning. And so in a way, the panels are kind of like a tartan or a grid pattern. And so then there's a kind of a Scottish character in the book who is relating to the tartans. And it's Norman Mclaren. So Norman Mclaren was I guess, Scottish-derived filmmaker, and he worked in Canada for the National Film Board and did all these amazing hand-painted films that were very experimental with their optics and drawing the soundtrack as well. So as a filmmaker, I was getting really interested in this kind of work, and the idea of the materiality of the film, and maybe transposing that to the materiality of the comic page. So you have the Scottish guy who shows up in the book, Norman, where is he? Norman Mclaren. He's this guy, he wears like a tam o' shanter, and he's an optical scientist, and he appears in the first page of the book. Here he is. So that's Norman Mclaren, basically. He's riding his bike up a mountain. And he has developed in this book this optical invention that is not really precisely named, but people are trying to blow him up because of it with drone strikes. And so it takes place in this kind of imaginary Scotland. And then Mr. Colostomy is sort of the detective who's getting involved in this case. That's how the book begins. And it doesn't resolve that in any way. But as it goes on, Norman Mclaren's sister has these two kids, and they turn into particles at the end of the day when the sun sets. So I was thinking a lot about, well, my sister has two kids. Both of my sisters have two kids. I think when this book was starting, my other sister had just had her second kid. I'm trying to, okay, well, there's sisters with two kids in my life. So I was and they're vanishing in the night and turning into particles. Now that has something to do with light. And the fact that Norman Mclaren is this kind of optical character has to do with the mystery of light and shadow. So I was thinking, okay, so another source of Mr. Colostomy was this book. I was like, optics are so interesting. And, I'm working in film as well, in comics, and trying to bridge these things together. So I started trying to read this book of Isaac Newton's Optics. And he did all these experiments. He figured out the rainbow from a prism, and did all these kind of like home experiments with optics, and figured out things about light having rays, and I don't know what he figured out. I couldn't understand this book, but I tried to read it anyway. But one thing I like is not understanding things. I like trying to understand something and then converting it into some kind of energy through not understanding it. So I was reading this and thinking a lot about shadows and light and the Norman Mclaren character and noir. So the book eventually became daily trying to reckon with these problems, like clock in with these problems. So I was thinking, what are optics? What is a shadow? What does it mean? What does it mean that light is a particle? And how does that relate to like making stippling dots on a piece of paper? Like, when I'm making dots, it seems like light particles somehow. And even the window frame design of the book started to seem like a something that they would call in early optics a diffraction grating, which is when you take a very thin rules of lines and hold it up to a light beam, it actually splits up the light beam into its prismatic colors. So I was almost thinking, and maybe this is a weird leap of logic, but I was thinking of the book, of the grid of the book, and how it relates to like a tartan as being a diffraction grating for light passing through, or even for experience passing through and getting filtered and turned into something else in kind of a prism. So this book is kind of a prismatic optical event happening. And there are color pages. Eventually it does go into color, but only on the weekends. So
So that's kind of where I started from, but I had no idea where these stories were leading. But as I was drawing and thinking about optics and thinking about families disappearing and fragmenting and turning into particles, and having this horse character supposedly solving these mysteries. Now, Mr. Colostomy is this character I've had for a long time. I don't know if I can find my first. I was going to try to pull it out, but the first appearance of Mr. Colostomy was a long time ago. I should have gotten this beforehand. Well, I don't know. A long, long time ago. I can't find it. Okay, I've been drawing this Mr. Colostomy character, Talking Horse, since like 2002. He was in a comic called Mining the Moon. He's always just been this surrogate adventurer, detective character who doesn't understand the world, much like me. I'm him, basically, or I'm horse, whatever the pronoun for horse is. So Mr. Colostomy is this functional character, but in this he changes. There's a slippage where he loses his personality. He starts off, he's a detective. He's trying to find these kids. At some point, he splits into two Mr. Colostomys through this optical film phenomena. He gets filmed, and they film him on twos, which is like an animation idea. So they take two frames, and then at that point, Mr. Colostomy becomes two. So it splits the character, and then he has two different jobs. In one, he's a letter carrier. He's a mailman, and in another one, he's sort of like dreaming and having this ongoing weird dream that he can't wake up from. So a lot of this book is about dreams. Obviously, it's very surrealistic and like nonlinear narrative, which has to do with dreams and with things like Nightmare on Elm Street type characters that can attack you in your dreams, Freddy Krueger type figures. Like there's this sheep that comes out and relates to going upstate and seeing these sheep farms that I was interested in. So there are sheep that are sort of pursuing the characters in their dreams. And it has to do with, okay, so the opposite of dreams, I would say, is insomnia. And I think the plot sort of hinges on these feelings that are underneath all these weird story details about being in the world and like what you're able to do in the world and what you're given to do in the world. So I guess by what I mean is like the way that you're kind of in this programmed, systematized world, capitalist world, and you get up from your dream and you go and you, I don't know what, you work at your computer at the coffee shop. That's what a lot of people seem to do these days. Or they go to their job and they sit at a desk. And so I was thinking a lot about the way the coffee shops were kind of, and I was working in them. I was working in the coffee shop doing this artwork. And so I would start to draw these like kind of dystopian scenes, thinking about what people were doing in the coffee shop. They're launching drone strikes. I was like, what if all these people who are like supposedly working are actually like flying drone missions over Yemen or something like that and killing people? And then I started to think that's the noir side of Mr. Colostomy, where there's this shadow to everything. And even though it takes place in the daytime, even though it was being drawn in the daytime, I was starting to see the world around me as being a kind of shadow world, where this darkness is kind of cloaking the world. And so there's various weird things that happen. The children are disappearing and turning into particles at night. They really want to go to a coffee shop. Their mom is trying to take them to see this pantomime performance instead, but they run off and they disappear and they go to the coffee shop. Meanwhile, there are people who are getting turned into coins because they can't pay for sleep. So sleep becomes a monetized or capitalist thing. You can either pay for sleep, which comes in the form of a sheep, or you can just drink as much coffee as you can and stay awake. So there are these ways of dealing with, I guess, capitalism and what I see around me in the world around me in a absurd way. And one of those is the creation of cartoon characters. And I feel like that the funny animal is like our only hope to break through all of the angst and tension and misery, of the world by creating something we can laugh at and creating jokes about it and humor. So that's why this is not an experimental, essay or something. Like, that's why this is a comic strip, because I find that that's the best way that I can deal with these dark shadows of the world is through laughing, trying to make people laugh. And I think this is a funny book. I think there's a laugh every page. So I'm proud of it. And when I first saw it, I was horrified. When I saw it all together, I was like, oh no, what have I done? This book has no shape. It's this big meandering mess. It doesn't even end. It doesn't really have an ending. But now that I see it as more of a formal experiment, later it makes sense to me. It's like you have a dream, and then later you can sort of analyze the dream and it kind of makes sense. But so I think if there's any value in this book, it uses form in an interesting way, and it asks questions of like what a comic strip is in an interesting way, as an experiment, and more than just entertainment or some very literal thing like telling a literal story. I think that this is kind of like a medium. It is a book as a kind of medium that transfers. A medium is like a liquid or like a light ray that transfers some information back and forth. So I think this book functions as kind of like a medium for different thoughts and emotions. So I don't know. That's what I can say about it initially. But does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? And I can answer them in the chat. Maybe we can start from some questions. Okay, so I'm looking through. Okay, so responding to Jose's question, you trace the rules before starting to draw the book. No, they are just they're just ruled out freehand. Yeah, they're just freehand. They're not very they're not even very straight. Sometimes I feel like when you have a comics page, and like when I sit down and there's a blank page and there's a meditative part of ruling out the panel borders that makes me feel centered and is almost like meditative. Like, it's ruling out the borders is almost like the chant of Om or something. It's just this very simple structure to then start, putting the craziness into the structure. But I don't know. I think you can see in the comics some of them are messier than others and more wiggly than others. But I like a certain tension between wiggliness and right angles. Okay, does anybody have any? Let me see. I'll look at any more questions. Any more questions? Did anything in your environment affect the drawing of the comic while you were in coffee shops? Yeah. So I can remember, one thing about this book is I tried to put the locations where I was drawing into I tried to sort of make a note of the different spots in the comic where I was drawing. So I don't know if all of these places are here anymore, but this one was drawn on the bus, Eastern bus, Dweebs, was a coffee shop I used to go to in Bushwick all the time. And I was definitely focused, but also you have a certain, sometimes I find it easy to work in an environment where there's a certain amount of white noise, like babble, cash registers going ching, you hear the sound of as people are doing the espresso, and then you hear people's conversations and what they're about, and those start to filter into the comic. So I think there's one page where it definitely is like these people walking and talking, and this is just what I would hear around me, what people were saying: Ghostbusters, Zelda, emoji, Stranger Things, Fresh Direct, Uber, followers, bank card. And then his friend is saying, of Montreal, Muji sublet on Yelp, Bluetooth IPA, Alamo Drafthouse CEO. So that's kind of what my garbled collaged version of what people are talking about, and kind of a sarcasm there, I guess, too. But that's kind of what it sounds like when it's filtered through. And then I think they're throwing a coffee cup in the garbage, and then so these are sort of like your average, young consumer people, and then there's somebody like digging in the garbage as people do, looking for recycling. And then there's Groomfiend the mouse, who I haven't talked about yet, but he's kind of like, he's living in the garbage inside the bottle that's thrown away. And so there's different ecosystems at play in the book. And later Groomfiend is like in the coffee shop, and this guy is saying, oh, here it is. Which one is it? He's saying, I don't understand how you make money. And Groomfiend says, I'm a piss guide. And then there's your average coffee shop guy, and Groomfiend says, I'll show you the way. And he sort of directs him under the tables to the bathroom. And eventually the joke is that he leads him out and invites him to pee between the two cars. So yeah, there definitely was the reality of the coffee shop and the outside world filtering into my my internal reality, and sometimes being used as material, but not really all the time, or usually be filtered in some way. I'm trying to think of other examples. The book changes a lot because in the first bit I was living in different places in Brooklyn, and then it kind of goes into an upstate section where I was living upstate. And then there's a lot of stuff referencing this town called Baby Town, which is kind of like Catskill or Hudson, like a town where everybody's like sort of immature or something. And there's various real estate speculations happening in Baby Town. And at some point, Mr. Colostomy and Groomfiend, his mouse friend, go back in time to the origin of Baby Town. And it's sort of explained that it was formed by a bunch of children who had a revolution, and the children run away from their parents, rebel against their parents, and end up starting their own town, a Baby Town. So, and then in the last part of the book, I was living in Baltimore, and there's a kind of a whole Baltimore section, which is this the gargoyle carver's sort of coda of the book, which is like a lot to do with figuration and statues and time and film and things like that. Yeah, I was also making a film while I was doing this book. So kind of the two main projects were, making sure I sat down every day and drew Mr. Colostomy, and then rushing around in this car and filming people on 16 millimeter and trying to make this piecemeal film. And that started in upstate and ended in Baltimore. So the two projects are sort of mirror each other. The film is called Fleegeeks, and it's also like a very weird, unfinished fragmentary thing that goes in all these different directions and has this sort of loose narrative themes. Okay, so more questions. Reader JNTJR, do you have moments of creative restraint with your characters and their actions depicted in the comics? If so, do you overlook it, or is it something you find that needs to be addressed when you're making your comics? Um, I would say that in order to like create a character that is understandable, there's a kind of restraint involved, like the shape of the character, um, if it's familiar or recognizable, like becomes a kind of typographic symbol or handwriting symbol. So Mr. Colostomy looks like this, and Groomfin the mouse looks like this, and has ears that are like that. If you sort of betray those rules, then you lose a kind of identification with the various characters, and then your kind of weird machine breaks down a little bit. So I think there was maybe visual restraint with the characters, but that's almost so I can mess with the rules. And Mr. Colostomy at some point says that he's not a horse, he's a mouse, or he identifies as a mouse, species wise. So, but he just looks like a horse. So Mr. Colostomy is actually a mouse. He actually works for 1-800-MICE. So that's the reveal, something that's revealed in the comic. So that was me sort of like playing with maybe the restraint of the character at some point. Yeah, his job changes and he sort of is in a different reality. I'm not sure if that's what you mean exactly. I feel like character, when you're devising characters, like one way to think about it is just to go the tendencies, like this character's personality is that they would tend to do this in this situation, or they would tend to do that. Like Groomfiend is homeless mouse who lives in the park. But then it's always fun to tweak that and have more complicated characters, and that's when you get maybe more interesting characters who are more three-dimensional, when you know the tendency of the character, but then they also can surprise you or do something against. That's I think more of this next level emotional idea of comics, is when you can create somebody who's actually alive in your work. And I don't know if I entirely do that. I think a lot of times my comics, since they're so jokey, they tend to be kind of surface characters, but I don't know. I think they kind of follow their own constraints. Okay, so do you have moments of creative restraint? Blah blah blah. Okay, I hope that answered that question. So Megan Cat Shrine, why a horse? Was there a specific reason why Mr. Colostomy is a horse? I maybe like 20 years ago, I liked to go to the horse races, and I was making videos to show to Rebecca Bird, like one video, a video just for one person, in which I would be this character, Mr. Colostomy, but he wasn't a horse. He was just kind of a voice, and his voice was based on somebody we mutually knew. And so, like, Mr. Colostomy's voice is kind of like this. He's kind of got this elegant voice. And so he was kind of this voice first, and later, because maybe of the horse races, he turned into a horse. And I don't know what. It's just, in the tradition of funny animals, there's Mickey Mouse, and there's Mr. Ed, and there's only so many animals, and there's versions of them over and over through history. There's talking ducks and talking mice and geese. There's not too many, like, rarer animals, like, a platypus or a hedgehog or a marmot or a mosquito. You don't see those animals. You tend to see these mammals. And I think there's something about, like, thinking what the horse is. It's kind of an animal that's wrong. Like, it's supposed to be like this, and it's standing up on four legs. So there's a kind of sentience to the horse that maybe is just inherently funny because it's, like, wrong. And I don't know what else. Like, a horse, if you think of what a horse means, well, it's this burden animal, and a traveling animal, and an animal that was a beast of burden, that later became kind of a luxury animal that, you know, rich people ride around, or a speed animal, you know, in races. Like, and I just like drawing them. I like drawing the horse. So there's a lot of different. There's also the horse in if you think of like Muybridge, like the early Muybridge films, and like maybe just looking at those that image over and over again of the galloping horse in early animation, maybe really think of, oh, if I can draw a horse legs well, I can do anything or something. But yeah, and then I mean, Mr. Colostomy is named. I don't know why he has that name, but it's just, I was thinking about it the other day, like, you know, an ostomy is like an opening. I don't know, it's like an opening in the body. So maybe on a metaphorical level, it's like a way for things to come out of the body, like sort of in a not normal way. You know, it's not an internalized system, it's an externalized system. So Mr. Colostomy is some sort of opening, whether that's a emotional one or a narrative one. Okay, so more questions. Okay, thanks. Okay, I guess that did answer the question, readers JNJR. But yeah, if I don't answer it, you're welcome to add more. Patrick Weeks, almost instrumental voices, improvising new harmonies. Thank you. Yeah, I do think that there's something like about music practice in writing comics. It's kind of like a daily thing. One thing that I feel like is like the selling point to this book is it was all drawn without mistakes. Like, I decided that cartoonists are always obsessed with mistakes and fixing mistakes, and artists, quote unquote, you know, are like, here's my drawing, that's my hand. So I was like thinking about the idea of forgiving all your mistakes, or making a comic in which one of the rules was there was no mistake. Like, not that I'm too good to make a mistake, but that a mistake would be allowed. So I would have to deal with the mistake. And I think that has to do with improvisation, and that has to do with music, because you know, you go see somebody, they're playing a set live, it's like awesome, it's just got energy. It may have quote unquote mistakes, but that's part of the experience of watching somebody generate something in real time. As somebody who's done a lot of music, I understand that, and I think all my art is sort of interested in this idea of improvisation, and like including mistakes into the composition. And that's why I brought up the idea of parapraxis, which is this Freudian slip. And you know, on the back of the book it says something about it. So the idea of that is like, the Freudian slip is like when you say something and you're like, you know, I didn't mean to get a cup of carpets, and then, well, I mean cup of coffee, but then you actually were thinking about carpets, right? So the mistake conceals a wish for carpets, maybe. So that, I think, is interesting, to incorporate that wish into the comic form instead of trying to fix your mistakes, which with whiteout and stuff like that. And I like how the pages look without any scribbling out or cross-hatching on them. So yeah, there's something about mistakes and forgiveness and improvisation and music. Thanks for that comment. I appreciate that. Okay, so from Ada2223, I have a question about time. How does the everyday practice that you were following relate to the temporality that is internal to the plot? Yeah, that's interesting, because I think in a lot of comics, I think it unfolds in real time in the same way as the Arabian Nights, where it's like every day advances the plot, but there's not like any sort of I was okay with things just rolling along in a 1-to-1 scale. So one one page of Mr. Colostomy is one day of life, of my life. And if you write down, if you have experiences, everybody has experiences, but if you like try to write a diary, sometimes you'll find that it's overwhelming even to like describe everything that happened during one night if you really try to get into all the details. And so there's a certain amount of blurring or picking out of the savory or interesting details. So I was okay with Mr. Colostomy floating parallel to my time stream, and then maybe picking out one or two incidents and distilling them. But I didn't do any kind of crazy things with time, like be like 100 years later. The funny thing about comics is like you do this for 3 years and it takes like a couple hours to read. So there's a compression of time inherent in all comics and in really all time-based medium. That's really interesting to me. Like film does the same way, especially animation does the same way. You're compressing and shrinking experience down. And yeah, and at one point Mr. Colostomy gets shrunk down to miniature world by a camera, and then has adventures in this shrunken time. So I hope that answers that question somewhat. Okay, Spiritual Compiler. Do you have any special intentions or motivations for making comics? Probably not special, other than I really like to draw. I like to make work all the time. I like to have an audience that is able to see work all the time. I don't like to labor over something and have it not be seen. I like to have control over it being seen, so I don't particularly like the model of artwork that's sort of like on spec, where you're making all this artwork and maybe a gallery likes it or maybe they don't, and it just like then you just throw it away at the end of your life. I like it to communicate. There's something about writing and drawing together that's always interested me. I've always made kind of illustrated books since I was a kid. Starting when I was 12, I was making comics as soon as I found out. I feel like I like the low bar that's in comics, where it's like anybody can work with paper and a pen, and it's very low budget. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful community. The comics community has always been very like welcoming, and they respond. You can make work and take it to a fair and show it to people, and it's very sort of horizontal, democratic community to be involved in, and that's always great. Yeah, it's I like all art forms. I like music and I like film, but I come back to comics all the time because you can just Xerox something, and I'm doing another serialized thing now, where it's like a newspaper, just to send out to people, because I like sending something every month to people. Okay, thanks for that question. Drawn and quarterly. Okay, Patrick Weeks, thank you for articulating lots of threads. Well, thank you for tuning in, and yeah, just think of how many threads there are in this tartan, and I promise you there are just as many threads in Mr. Colostomy as there are in this book. So I guess that's it. Please buy my book. It will enable me to make more. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you enjoy Mr. Colostomy. I will leave with a song.